Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
A much-loved sport amongst fervent fans and football enthusiasts, this game has beckoned millions to its allegiance, dominating the world of sports on a global scale and in some cases apparently captivating even the scariest of sorts. In this story, a group of friends journey back in time to relay their appalling tale, which they claim occurred during a friendly match with fellow schoolmates at a random field in the district during the 1990s. En route to their destination, the group cycled past a row of wooden houses and shops before reaching a wide stretch of road leading to the open field. Although the sun radiated its golden rays over the turf, a disturbing presence loomed in the dark shadows of the forest and seemed to drape the surroundings in a menacing facade. Wilted leaves cloaked the paved walkway as a decrepit rest house stood beside the precipice landscape. This didn't bother the youngsters at all as they geared up to begin their much-awaited football match. It started off as an exciting first half, but 15 minutes into the next round, the goalkeeper kept a wary gaze at the nearby electrical poles. The curious lot stared blankly at their only source of defense against a possible goal and threw the ball in his direction. "Azam, what are you staring at? Focus on the game, otherwise we'll have to Balanya the other team if we lose," Nasri said. The goalie simply nodded and laughed at the mild teasing, but an evident fear loomed in his eyes. As the game intensified, Dodd, another player, skillfully maneuvered the ball in an attempt to strike for goal, but before he could hit home, the striker dropped to his knees and twitched in pain. The others rushed to his aid and offered to escort him to the hospital, but instead, Dodd refused and opted to watch the game despite the untimely injury. While cheering on from the sidelines, he was taken aback by what seemed to be a piece of linen cloth dangling from one end of the electrical poles, but dismissed it as nothing out of the ordinary. He occasionally diverted his attention back to the poles and was surprised to find that the linen had shifted to another area. Only this time, it resembled a formidable apparition. His heart skipped a beat as he quickly glanced at the leaden sky. Darkness engulfed the skies as the sun took its leave over the horizon, radiating the last strokes of light, which resembled orange smears in the dusk, indicating that night was fast approaching. "It's just my imagination. Must be the pain from my ankle," Dodd thought silently to himself and snubbed the idea of informing his friends about the strange sighting. Both teams refused to surrender to defeat, and before long, night had fallen. "Just one goal," Razak playfully said as they jubilantly tried to win the match. Then, a striker from the opposing team attempted to make his mark but inexplicably smashed his volley into the nearby forest. The players stole quick glances at one another, indicating their refusal to retrieve the ball from the creepy terrain. One of their teammates, Ali, eventually volunteered to recover the object and immediately emerged from the woods after a few short seconds. That was fast, so excited to win the game. Nasri teased, but his happy-go-lucky friend remained silent. A solemn look darkened his expression. The others simply shrugged off Ali's sulky mood and thought the poor guy was fuming over recovering the ball earlier on. As the match continued, Razak reinforced their attacking options and crossed for Ali to clip home the first goal, but his teammate stood unresponsive to his gestures. Rage overwhelmed the defiant defender as he marched across the field to give Ali a piece of his mind. "If you're angry over a small matter, don't play. You're just standing there like a statue. And why in the world do you reek of dead rats?" Razak shouted while covering his nose. Again, Ali maintained his poker face. While the outburst transpired, Nasri tapped the furious defender on the shoulders and pointed towards the direction of the woods. Before them, their blithe comrade emerged from the dark shadows and ran hastily towards the others. "Sorry guys, took a while for me to find the ball," Ali said nonchalantly. The players exchanged bewildered looks amongst themselves as their eyes searched the grounds for the mysterious doppelganger and remained practically speechless at the bizarre ordeal. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Ali said, his eyebrows frowning at the uncanny glances around him. Dodd limped towards the disorientated lot and disclosed the mysterious sighting he had spotted earlier on. Azam confirmed the bizarre incident, for he too caught a glimpse of the entity. "We had better leave. This isn't a good sign," Razak said. As they gathered their belongings, a ball ricocheted against the goal post and into the field. It moved bafflingly across the turf on its own and suddenly came to an abrupt stop. Out of the blue, it struck Razak on the face with a sturdy force as blood started oozing out from his nose. Fear paralyzed the entire team instantaneously, and they scurried from the premises, leaving behind all their belongings. The perplexed lot stared in amazement at Dodd's sudden vigor and agility, for he zoomed past the rest despite his so-called injury. "I never ran so fast in my life. All I felt was numbness, but was more concerned about the impending terror behind us," Dodd joked. The scampering crowd came to a sudden stop as a ghostly apparition emerged from the forest and glided towards the players while clasping a child's bloody hands in the other. They vaguely caught sight of its distorted face and some managed to make a run for it, but the others panicked and remained solidly still. As it released a petrifying laugh, the entity moved towards Razak and stared at him intently with its bloodshot eyes. The others summoned their inner strength and began reciting prayers to ward off the spirit. It took on a defensive stance and attempted to shatter their fortitude by disrupting the group's unified chants. Its ear-piercing snarl sounded like a pack of wolves howling in the night, but they kept their grit together till the spirit disappeared into thin air. The terrified lot nervously retreated to the exit, reciting prayers each step of the way. After a good 5 minutes, the group sighed in relief as they reached the junction to the main road. A deafening silence fell upon them as they ruminated over the uncanny state of affairs that ensued earlier. Their nightmare was, however, far from over. At night, the foreboding shadows crept into their homes, fueling a lurid episode of bizarre occurrences. The group was plagued by a series of poignant haunting as 3 of them came down with mysterious illnesses that triggered anomalous hallucination and paranoia for months, while the others experienced encounters out of the norm. Days after the dreadful field experience, Razak claims that his parents saw a ghostly apparition prying through his bedroom window. They initially perceived that it was a woman and child, who probably required help, but as it turned around to confirm their suspicion, the couple remained silent and intuitively knew what it was. A creaking sound then echoed near the gallery as they hurried towards the door to tentatively secure the bolt. "They don't need the door, dear. They can simply go through any wall," Razak's father implied as his wife gestured for him to hush down. Peering through the corners of the shutters, his mother caught sight of a poltergeist commonly known as Hantu Pachong to the locals, but soon vanished into the shadows. The phenomenal encounters, seemingly plucked from the scenes of a horror film, continue to remain a mystery. In Azam's case, several visits scared the wits out of him as he struggled to fight his fears. One night, a loud banging erupted on the front door. My parents thought it was a late visitor, but after peeking through the window, they caught sight of a paranormal entity gliding from one corner of the house to the other, he said frightfully. The daunting episodes didn't stop there. At the stroke of 3 in the morning, he could perceive the sounds of loud footsteps, which then faded along the dark corridors. This was followed by strident thuds on the roof, which sounded like giant fingers drumming from above. Now in their mid-20s, the group of friends evidently illustrate their hidden fears as they reminisce over the events of that fateful year. "It's been more than 10 years, but the events remain freshly imprinted in my mind," Razak said. The notorious field, known for its lurid ghost stories, has undergone major transformations throughout the years, and a building now stands in its place. The colorful blossoms and green pastures have supplanted the once gloomy surroundings. Behind the building, the great forest loomed high above the grounds and concealed its sinister facade. We probably stepped into forbidden grounds or accidentally offended the malevolent spirits. Whatever the case, this is something no one should experience.
The Fisherman's Friend. A common pastime amongst people of all ages, this famous sport has provided an excellent opportunity for families and friends to bond and spend quality time together. Such was the intention of a young student who invited his friends for a boys' night out fishing along one of the well-known rivers in the district. In this story, Cairo recalls the horrifying events which occurred on that fateful night. As they set out on their journey at midnight, the group of 3 were feeling absolutely jubilant, having just completed their public examinations. The humid clouds, which swelled above them, did not look promising and projected an impending thunderstorm. That, of course, failed to hinder the group's journey. After setting up their fishing rods, they decided to hunt for their quarry near the jetty and waited patiently for the rewards. It was a dark, eerie night, and although my instincts told me something wasn't right, I didn't want to be a party pooper, Cairo said. An hour or so passed when something tugged heavily at the fishing reel. "Guys, I think we caught something big," Samad shouted excitedly, but as he attempted to pull in his catch, he found nothing. "Maybe you didn't place the bait properly," Charles suggested. Confused and bewildered by the strange episode, Samad took out a tackle box to replace his reel and used live prawns instead of worms. "Hope this will work better," Samad said and cast his bait into the river. Out of nowhere, a gust of cold wind blew gently in his direction. He turned his gaze towards Cairo, who was sitting quietly by the riverbank. "Hey Kai, you all right?" but received no response. "What's wrong with this fellow?" Samad asked himself and decided to approach his seemingly quiet friend. While he was talking to Cairo, two men emerged from the parking lot. At first, Samad thought they were anglers looking to enjoy a fishing expedition, but as he looked closely, he noticed that the two men were none other than his buddies. If Kyril is there, who in the world is beside me? Samad thought, and without thinking, he ran towards his friends without looking back. Samad struggled to contain himself and was practically hysterical. He told them about his ordeal, and instead of comforting him, they laughed. "There's no one here besides us. I think you watch too many horror films, my friend," Kyril said. Furious and agitated, Samad marched into the parking lot and chose to wait for his ignorant friends in the car. The two continued fishing and were not at all bothered by the incident. As they laughed away to the jokes and tales of their youths, they were distracted by what seemed to be 1,000 flickering sounds. To their amazement, a shoal of fish splashed furiously against the water as if it were sending a signal. At that instant, something tugged at their fishing reel, but instead of catching a big fish as they had anticipated, an amputated head hung on their hook, covered in dark, murky slime. Charles instantly tossed the rod into the river and watched as the head floated towards the jetty. The two stood frozen in their tracks as they caught sight of a supernatural being dressed in black sitting by the jetty without a head. It then leaped into the water and crawled to shore before vanishing into the woods. Without hesitating, the two ran towards their car, leaving all the equipment behind. Samad was sleeping contentedly in the back seat as they drove off. The return home turned out to be a bizarre odyssey as they began hearing disembodied voices coming from the back. As the two boys turned around, they saw the paranormal entity clinging onto the back of the vehicle. Charles turned on the radio and recited prayers to ward off the spirit. None of the three coveted to sleep alone that night. This has triggered months of restless nights for us, and sometimes, we sense a strange presence, especially when either three of us are alone. We have definitely learned a lot from this and will probably go fishing only in the afternoons, Kyril said before concluding the group's terrifying tale.
The Uninvited. Legends of old have it that an individual who possesses a fragile spirit will most likely encounter supernatural entities, and although no evidence of such a claim exists, some have unfortunately experienced it firsthand for reasons they cannot fathom. This story revolves around an American expatriate who was kind enough to share his ordeal before leaving the country for good. David loved Brunei and considered it as his second home. He even planned to settle down with his then fiancée living in Kuala Lumpur, and thus frequently traveled back and forth to visit his better half. Working in a highly demanding field, which required every ounce of his expertise, commuting from the capital to the Balate district daily was painstaking and inconvenient, but he longed to put a balance between his work and fiancée. Days and sometimes even months at a time, the pressuring demands of his career began to take its toll on their relationship. One fateful night, they got into a heated argument and his fiancée threatened to commit self-end. After several attempts to call her hand phone, which went unanswered, he grabbed his car keys and drove hastily to Kuala Lumpur. "Please answer the phone, please," David pleaded. He then began blaming himself should anything unforeseen happen to his fiancée and could not imagine life without her. He then approached the one-lane road and focused on the dark, eerie highway where no street lamps were erected. Suddenly, the radio reception started to deteriorate and David simply thought it was due to the location. A few minutes later, the car engine began to quiver and decelerate from 120 to 80 kilometers per hour. What in heaven's name could possibly go wrong now? He exclaimed as it was a brand new car. "Do not break down here, please, of all places," David said while glancing around at the pitch-black darkness without a single soul in sight. He pulled himself together and tried to dismiss all negative thoughts coming to mind. As he attempted to lean on the armrest, David caught sight of what seemed to be a shadow in the corner of his eye. Without thinking, he turned to confirm his worst fear, and indeed, there was a weird figure sitting beside him in the front passenger seat. The entity's long black strands of hair covered its face as she repeatedly let out a blood-curdling laugh. Shivers ran down his spine and 1,000 thoughts raced through the businessman's mind. Given the fact that he is a free thinker, no religion or prayers could save him then, as he knew none. David thought of calling someone, practically anyone, but his phone was in the middle of the dashboard. Terrified that the entity would grab his hands, he continued driving, hoping, praying that a street lamp would appear with some visible signs of life. A few minutes on, David's instincts sent a warning jolt through his body. He could sense that the spirit was staring at him and his heart raced with sheer trepidation. Straight ahead, visible strokes of light could be seen, and he stepped on the gas pedals hoping to reach the area before something happened to him. That seemed to only make things worse. With the streetlights, he could clearly see his uninvited passenger. The events that followed would remain embossed in his memories forever. The spirit extended its arms to grab his shoulders. He immediately stepped on the brakes and ran out of the car. David refused to turn around for fear that it was nearby, but decided to fight his fear after remembering his fiancée. After I saw it was gone, I went back into my car and drove off like never before, David said, after reconciling with his fiancée. He retold his frightful story and later discovered that the entity was in fact a Pontianak. This has altered my complete outlook in life, and I now refuse to travel anywhere alone if it's 3 a.m, he said while giggling, but behind the laughter, the impact of that encounter could be visibly seen through his eyes.
The White Sands. Most Bruneians nationwide are familiar with this urban legend. Countless tales of horror have been whispered in the air, and some experienced firsthand the terrifying occurrences in this place. Peter, a local businessman, was more than happy to share his story, and it revolved around the White Sands leading up to. Road users often pass by this area when heading off to the Belait district or neighboring Malaysia. Peter claims that his close encounter happened on the eve of New Year as he traveled home to be with his family in Syria. Festive songs played on the radio as he sang along to the medleys, grateful that he will finally spend New Year with his loved ones for the first time in 5 years. Not long after he reached the area, a disturbing sight caught his attention. Glancing at the counter clock, it was a little after I was. Why is she walking alone at this hour? Peter asked himself. He stopped the car by the roadside and approached the seemingly oblivious woman, who continued walking even after Peter called out to her. Concerned that the woman might need help or a ride, he attempted to speak to the woman. "Excuse me, miss, do you need help?" Peter asked. She stopped walking and turned slowly towards him. Her long black locks covered her pale face as she gestured towards a junction and pointed to a deserted rest house nearby. Seeing as though something was amiss, Peter stepped back and asked, "Are you all right? Are you heading that way?" The woman simply nodded. "Please let me give you a ride," he said, and opened the front passenger door for her. As he turned to face the woman, she suddenly disappeared and was nowhere in sight. Shivers ran down his spine as he stared at the pitch-black darkness, the silence becoming somewhat deafening. Instead of panicking, he drove off and continued his journey without ever looking back. "It frightened me out of my wits," Peter said before concluding his story.
The Haunted Highway. Pontianaks or vampires are basically the most notorious group of paranormal entities, and their popularity is evident through their portrayals in horror films and fiction movies. In this story, Ahmed, a man in his mid-20s, claims to have encountered these strange entities while driving home from Tudong town. This unfortunate incident triggered months of restlessness and paranoia, but yet here, he recalls the sequence of events leading up to that fateful night as he faced his worst nightmare. Driving down the highway, Ahmed tried to adjust his focus and eyes on the road as fatigue and lethargy took control of his body. The long working hours at his new job had taken its toll and left him practically exhausted. After several failed attempts to keep himself awake, Ahmed finally gave in and decided to stop at the side of the road to get some shut-eye before continuing his journey. As he turned to make a stop, his eyes caught sight of a strange-looking object in the middle of the road that seemed to resemble a log, but simply shrugged it off as nothing out of the ordinary. However, as Ahmed peered closer at the weird object, he could make out some facial features, but it was too dark to tell whether his imagination was beginning to run wild. Despite the warning which echoed in his mind to run away, he simply refused to steer clear of whatever was on that road. Curiosity got the better of him, and he took out a torchlight out of the glove compartment to investigate what it really was. As Ahmed approached the object, it laid so disturbingly still as if waiting to strike. He suddenly stood frozen in his tracks as the mysterious object lifted its head slowly in his direction and let out an ear-piercing cry. Fear overtook the very core of Ahmed's mind, and he knew instantly what the strange object was. He struggled to summon his inner strength to face the terror staring him right in the eye. "This was something that you could only see in horror films," Ahmed said. He watched the terror unfold as the paranormal entity, commonly known as Pontianaks to the locals, crawled to the side of the road and began creeping towards a lamp post. Within split seconds, it swiftly moved towards him, and all he could do was recite prayers to ward off the spirit. The Pontianak stared at him intently before disappearing into thin air. The memory of such a disturbing image, till this day, seems difficult to erase and has changed his philosophy on the existence of paranormal entities. I think it's a good idea to share my experience with the internet on this issue. Whether they choose to believe it or not is of course up to them. However, this is not something you simply make up. It took me quite a while to try and forget this horrifying incident, but I decided to instead use it as a lesson in life.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.